Good afternoon and welcome to episode 95 of the Political Mike podcast. Just before this past November's midterm election, Forbes revealed that slightly more than half of all American adults believed that democracy was not working well. And that was according to an Associated Press NORC poll, with a larger number of Republicans than Democrats holding a dim review of the state of democracy and the sanctity of the electoral process ahead of the midterm election season in November. According to the same poll, only around 9% of all U.S. adults believed that democracy in the United States was working extremely or very well, while 52% felt that it was not working well. The poll also indicated that views on the state of the U.S. democracy were heavily divided among party lines, with 15% of Democrats and only 5% of Republicans saying it was working well, a major flip from 6% and 23% respectively in 2020. Only 47% of Americans have had a great deal or quite a bit of faith, according to this poll, that their midterm election votes would be counted accurately, with 74% of Democrats being optimistic about the process compared to only a quarter of Republicans, despite there being no widespread evidence of fraud or issues with the counting process. 45% of Republicans have had no or very little faith in the integrity of the electoral process compared to only 8% of Democrats. This was a likely outcome of former President Donald Trump's repeated false claims about a stolen 2020 election. A New York Times Siena poll published earlier this week reported that 74% of likely voters believed that American democracy was under threat. The poll also found that 69% of registered voters trusted that the results of the midterm elections would be accurate. All of this comes now that the election is behind us, at a time when many are wondering if we're now in a new normal, when open hostility towards the opposition and political stunts are ingrained now in politics on Capitol Hill. As part of his deal with detractors, Speaker Kevin McCarthy named 3 conservative rabble-rousers, Representative Chip Roy of Texas, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, and Thomas Massie of Kentucky, to the influential Rules Committee, which decides how exactly bills come to the House floor. You have Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, former head of the Freedom Caucus, now sitting on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance. Dan Bishop of North Carolina, one of 13 holdouts who flipped to back McCarthy, will continue to serve on both the Judiciary and Homeland Security. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, a conspiracy theorist, someone who was cast doubt on the September 11th terrorist attacks and has actually made several anti-Semitic statements, now sitting on Homeland Security. And a host of others, including Matt Gaetz, who's now going to be sitting on the Judiciary panel, appointed by McCarthy to the new Weaponization Subcommittee. Here to join me again is Mr. Professor Steve Levitsky, who is a David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. He's also director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions. He's also the co-author of this book, How Democracies Die, and I'm so happy to have him with me today. So, Professor, thank you for joining. I want to start off the conversation by asking you this question, and that is, does the fact that MAGA election deniers now sit in prominent House committees signal to you that the United States is undergoing a democratic breakdown? I'm asking that in light of the fact that in your book, you talk about how the breakdown of democracies are no longer overt events where militaries engage in coups, but now we're starting to see the breakdown of democracies from within by elected leaders themselves. What do you say?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's a sign that American democracy is breaking down. In fact, for the most part, democracy is hanging in there. We survived the 2020 election. We survived the unprecedented effort to overturn the election violently. The 2022 election went reasonably well, without violence, without fraud. And so democracy is under threat. I mean, I agree with the majority of Americans who responded to that poll by saying that democracy is under threat, but it's not breaking down. What is worrisome, and this gets to your question, is that the Republican Party continues to be quite radicalized and quite extremist. It is not, as small d Democratic parties must do, it is not purged itself of violent and extremist elements. Democracies are only safe when mainstream political parties accept the results of elections, when mainstream political parties unambiguously renounce violence, and when mainstream political parties unambiguously break with extremist anti-democratic forces on their own flank. And the Republican Party is not doing any of those things, any of those three things consistently since Trump. And so Trump lost. Trump's star may or may not be on the political wane, but the extremist elements within the Republican Party not only are still there, but as you pointed out, are actually in the House caucus seem to be in ascent. So that's a bad sign. It's a worrisome sign. I'm not convinced that the Republican Party today is a party that's committed to playing by democratic rules of the game.
So also in your book, of course, the book has a litmus test on, basically 4 key indicators of authoritarian behavior. You have number 1, rejection of or weak commitment to democratic rules of the game, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of violence, and then readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. And for that 4th one, I thought about Bannon, of course, in alignment with what happened in the last election cycle. He was indicating through his podcast that he's looking forward to the GOP prosecuting, investigating, incarcerating many of those who investigated the previous administration for legitimate wrongdoings. I want to ask you, in light of the fact that former President Trump is now still a candidate. He's a candidate. He announced in November. Many heavyweight donors on the Republican side, including the Koch brothers, or Mr. Koch, I should say, have indicated that they would place their support elsewhere. There's optimism among those who are in the Beltway, from, for instance, Governor Chris Sununu, who was on this Sunday, indicating that he believes that Trump cannot beat President Biden, and that he has hope that there will be another Republican champion out there. What are your thoughts on Trump and his ability to garner support in light of the fact that we saw that the gatekeepers of the Republican Party failed to do their job? One of the main factors that you talk about that prevented demagogues from taking power for so long in the United States was that there were gatekeepers in both political parties. They failed to do their job, and you even indicate that they were a former shell of themselves. Go ahead, Professor.
No, and they still are. I mean, we don't know. I don't know whether Trump is capable of mobilizing the support necessary to win a primary. He may not. He's got there's some signs that he's losing support. He obviously retains a lot of support and is going to be competitive in a primary. The gatekeepers haven't changed. They haven't changed. They haven't gotten stronger. They haven't gotten more committed to democracy. There's no sign that they've got a great capacity for collective action. So it is entirely possible for to replay a scenario somewhat similar to 2016, in which all the people in the Beltway who are confident that it's not going to be Trump and who sort of off the record, wring their hands about Trump, get on board again if he's the winner. You don't see nearly enough Republicans saying Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and cannot, under any circumstances, be the nominee of this party, and we will do everything we can to stop it. No, they're saying, well, he might not be electable. Sununu says, well, he's probably not going to win. That's not enough. These guys have to come out and say, we made a terrible mistake in 2016. He's a threat to democracy, and he won't and cannot be the candidate again. Until that happens, I don't see why we can't reproduce 2016. That said, the other important thing with respect to the health of democracy and the future of the Republican Party is it's the alternatives to Trump may not be any more committed to democracy than him. I mean, there's nobody quite like Trump. There will never be another Trump. But the energy in the Republican Party, particularly the Republican Party base, its activist base, its primary voting base, the people who vote in primaries in the Republican Party, these are pretty radicalized folks at this point. They're not going to elect Chris Sununu. Write this down. They are not going to nominate Chris Sununu as the candidate. If somebody beats Trump, it's probably somebody who runs to Trump's right. And somebody like Ron DeSantis, who part of his success has been positioning himself oftentimes to Trump's right. He's not, he's very different from Trump. He's smarter than Trump. He probably would not sort of overtly try to overturn an election the same way Trump did. But if you look at how Ron DeSantis has behaved in Florida, this guy doesn't pass the litmus test either. This is a pretty authoritarian figure. And so even if Trump's days are behind him, even if Trump doesn't win the nomination in 2020, I don't see in the Republican Party the ability to nominate a candidate who's fully committed to democracy.
And this last December, the former president actually indicated, of course, he's still, casting doubt on the 2020 election results. He actually came out and said that certain parts of the Constitution should be suspended, in light of what he viewed as a skewed election or a rigged election. And he had some Republican, representatives in Congress coming out on the cable and Sunday political talk shows against his statement. You had, for instance, on the CBS Face the Nation show, Representative Lawler indicating that he objected to those remarks. He said that he believed that the people certainly are going to take into consideration a statement like this as they evaluate a candidate in 2024. You had Representative Mike Turner of Ohio, the top Republican on the House Intelligence Committee, saying that he vehemently disagreed and absolutely condemned the remarks. I want to ask you, how do you felt about Trump actually publicly supporting suspension of parts of the Constitution? Were you surprised at all in light of what you've already written in terms of that litmus test about how we can determine, from a mile away who is a demagogue, and also your response to the criticism? Is that too little, too late, in light of the intense and passionate support that he's received from these kinds of representatives for 4 years?
Yeah, of course it's too little, too late. Look, the reason you could not everybody's like Donald Trump again, but Donald Trump was a slam dunk in terms of identifying an authoritarian demagogue. It was very easy in 2015 to identify, and certainly during the campaign of 2016, to tell that Donald Trump was not a Democrat. He's not a small d Democrat. He's not committed to playing by democratic rules of the game. He ticked off all 4 boxes of our litmus test unambiguously. He got a straight A in that litmus, or straight F, however you want to grade it. There was no ambiguity about Donald Trump's commitment to democracy. He wasn't. And so the big shocker, which surprises me, is that Republicans went along with this guy for 6 years. And it's if they denounce his proposal to junk parts of the Constitution today, great. I applaud them. But it's obviously too little, too late, because the guy tried to lead a violent coup against our democracy a little over a year ago, and the Republicans didn't restrain him.
And of course,
so it's 6 years too late.
Exactly. And of course, we've seen the influence that January 6th has had on other countries, specifically the country Brazil. Brazil has also experienced their January 6th like event.
But if you don't mind me saying, Mike, the Brazilians handled it better. So when Lula won the election and Bolsonaro lost on election night, every major right-wing politician, every one of Bolsonaro's major political allies, the right-wing governors of the largest states, the president of Congress, the equivalent of Ron DeSantis and Kevin McCarthy, all of them came out on election night and said, Lula won, too bad. It's time to turn the page and we're going to work with the new president. When January 8th happened in Brazil, it happened when protesters stormed all three branches of government, which is beyond what happened in the United States. Every major politician in the country immediately came out and denounced them. Nobody said it was like tourists visiting the Capitol. Nobody talked about false flag operations. Nobody said it was Antifa. Nobody called them heroes. All of them, everybody from left to right in the Brazilian political spectrum denounced it. Even Bolsonaro eventually denounced it. So that's the way that small d Democrats respond to a tragedy like January 6th. Unfortunately, the Republican Party, again, didn't respond that way. So Brazilians responded in a much more democratic or democracy-preserving fashion than the Americans did.
And that's a good point. And of course, America was, very much involved. I mean, you had Steve Bannon, an American citizen, using his podcast to actually encourage and rile up those who were storming the Brazilian.
Yeah, but Steve doesn't speak Portuguese, so I'm not sure how much influence that has.
the Brazilian capital. He said Lula stole the election. Brazilians know this, and he wrote it repeatedly. He wrote that repeatedly on the social media site Getter. It's so amazing to see how the United States has such far-reaching influence on those, not just in the Western Hemisphere but around the globe. Even in Israel, you had Benjamin Netanyahu coming to power by building a strong coalition, leaning heavily on the right, which seems to be a key, a key way that a lot of folks around the world seem to be looking to seize power again. To your point earlier about DeSantis, a candidate further on the side of Trump on the right, becoming most likely the nominee. But finally, before I let you go, Professor, what are your thoughts on this balloon that has flown over the United States, the continental United States from Alaska, going through parts of Canada, and the criticism that the Biden administration has received for waiting until this balloon, which apparently or allegedly has been collecting surveillance in the United States, being shot down over the waters of Myrtle Beach? Should Biden not have listened to the military professionals and have taken action sooner, in your view?
We're still learning, getting reports about exactly what happened behind the scenes, what kind of intelligence the U.S. had and didn't have. But first and foremost, taking seriously the advice of your top military and intelligence officials, not a bad thing. Apparently, Biden his initial instinct was to shoot it down, but he cooler heads prevailed. I think if you think about the counterfactual, and they'd shot it down over Montana, and somebody had been killed, Biden would have been attacked for not waiting until it was over U.S. territory and putting at risk American lives. Now, my understanding is still we have limited information. My understanding is the U.S. was getting at least as much intelligence from this balloon as the Chinese were at the point that it was over Montana. That on the one hand, U.S. officials calculated that the cost of letting it go for a few days until it was safe to shoot down was low, and that the risk of shooting it down, even though Montana is not a particularly populated place, the risk to human lives was such that it was worth waiting. I have not seen any information that leads me to question the. It seems like it was a pretty thought out, consulted decision.
Well, Professor Levitsky, thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you once again. And again, for those who are interested in the book, How Democracies Die, excellent read. New York Times bestseller. And of course, I think it's a timeless read because it's not limited to just the Trump presidency. We can make predictions about how demagogic leaders come about, not just the United States, but across the globe. So I highly recommend this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you again, Professor.
Mike, we've got a follow-up book coming out in the fall called Tyranny of the Minority. It's a follow-up to How Democracies Die. So you have to bring me back.
I definitely want to invite you to come back because I'm looking forward to reading that one. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.
All right, take care of yourself. Thanks for having me.
All right, you too.